I have founded a group of people living with HIV, probably similar as Positiva Gruppen, the Positive Council in Switzerland. And for the past 30 years, I have been running this database, which I handed over a year ago to the HIV Justice Network. And let's look a little bit uh, about my experience and what uh, what I learned throughout the years. So in 1997, I was very sick at home and didn't know if I would survive HIV. And then I got in touch with the Swiss HIV Documentation Center, and they asked me to help them out on something on their website. And while doing that, I came across of some research done by the Swiss Department of Foreign Affairs. They had, I don't know for what reason, put together a list of countries that had entry and residence restrictions affecting people with HIV. As a former export director for a Swiss company, I got very nervous when I saw this. There was the US with a complete entry ban. There was all kinds of stuff on this list, and I thought, heck, I want to travel. I was used to travel a lot and couldn't imagine if I would survive that I wouldn't travel again. So I thought we need this information online, and we need to translate, and we need to keep this accessible to people living with HIV worldwide. In 99, I came across some German research that was done by the German AIDS Federation through the German embassy network. And they had found a little bit more than the Swiss because their network was better. And I went to see them in Berlin, and we decided to merge our data. And then we had a number of data collections in 97, in 2000, again in 2008. We set up the web page so we could receive user feedback. People who were traveling, people who were relocating could share their stories. We would put them online, and without disclosing the identity of the person, of course. And this is how the database continued to live. After having done that for 30 years on a very small budget, I found somebody who was willing to take it over, and that was the HIV Justice Network. They work on human rights issues in general, especially on the criminalization of transmission. They are friends of mine. They took it over, and they got a nice budget from a pharmaceutical company, a big one, to pay a really thorough update. So that's the new site now. It's called Positive Destinations. And I'm very happy that this website is now in good hands. The latest data they have shown in Kigali at the AIDS conference this year in July is that 83 countries have zero restrictions, severe restrictions in 17 countries, partial restrictions in 33 countries, no and unclear information in 69 countries. That seems a bit high to me, no and unclear information, 69 countries, but let's leave it there. I have not done the research. Something to bear in mind is that not all restrictions are HIV specific. We will go there a little bit. Australia and Canada are two countries that actually restrict the entry and stay, not the entry, but the residence permit for people with a chronic disease of any kind. So if you come with a diabetes, if you come with a cancer that requires treatment, if you come with whatever you could have as a chronic disease, they look at you very carefully. And in many cases, if the budget implications are too high, they would not give you a residence or work permit in these countries, in Australia and Canada. That's something very peculiar. New Zealand had the same policy until they dropped it 2 or 3 years ago. Now let's look a little bit what does it really mean, or what is behind. The legal situation and the reality may differ. So there might be a law, but it's not put into practice. When you have HIV test requirements for long-term stays, meaning long-term stays beyond 90 days is long-term. 90 days is what you get normally when you want to visit a country as a tourist, or for a business trip, you get to stay up to 90 days. So short-term is beyond that. You want to work, you want to study. If there is a test requirement for these long-term stays, they are usually implemented. So you won't get a permit if you're HIV positive, if there is such a requirement in the law. Tourism and business stays are usually possible despite entry bans. I cannot tell you how many times I was in the US when there was an entry ban. I cannot tell you in how many countries I was while there were entry bans. I always made it, and without any problems, because my stays were always short. The reason for these restrictions is historic, protecting public health and avoid potential cost for care and treatment. And actually, the countries banning people with an infectious disease has a long history, and that goes back to Columbus discovering America and coming back with syphilis. After that, people realized that when you have ports, when you have open doors to people coming from other continents, you risk importing transmittable diseases. So countries started to implement policies protecting their public health. You may know that the Brits call syphilis the Spanish disease because it was brought by Spaniards. And the French call it, I don't remember. So there is a historic baggage that convinced politicians about 40 years ago that they wanted to introduce entry restrictions for people living with HIV. Also important to bear in mind, the target of every legislation around is HIV infection. Undetectability is a new concept. It doesn't matter. So it's a question I often got by people, but I'm undetectable. It shouldn't matter. Yes, it doesn't, but not legally. It has no value. And not all barriers are due to legislation. This means that some barriers are set up not by politicians and not by countries, but by recruitment agencies. One example I often had were Philippine healthcare workers who wanted to work in the Middle East or who wanted to work in Europe. So now that they couldn't work in the Middle East is clear. But Europe had no such legislation. They could have got the work permit without a problem. But these agencies had an established practice internally to test everybody for HIV. And as soon as somebody had an HIV infection, they couldn't get the job, despite the recipient country not having any barriers. I saw this also with teachers who wanted to work in Korea, teachers who wanted to work, I don't know where. The sending country or the recruitment agencies were actually requiring an HIV test, a negative test result before accepting people. So not everything is due to legislation. So what I did over the years was collecting information and making information available. But of course, work had to be done on removing existing restrictions. And in 2008, UNAIDS formed a task team. They were forced to do that because the Global Fund wanted to organize a meeting in China about the Global Fund is organizing medication for people with HIV in countries with little resources. So they wanted to have a board meeting in Beijing, and they realized they couldn't have it because China had restrictions. They had people living with HIV on their board. So UNAIDS was obliged to organize a task team in 2008. We met for about 1.5 years with lots of people from different countries, countries with restrictions, countries without restrictions. Norway paid for the whole operation, and we issued some recommendations. I participated because I was the only one who actually had a database that gave the evidence about the problem. And until 2010, the entire focus was about removing the United States entry ban. Clinton had promised to remove it in 92, but then actually did the opposite. He changed the legislation so it would require an act of Congress to remove the restrictions, which was horrible. Getting an act of Congress is something terrible. In the US, you need both chambers to agree on something. But actually, in 2008, while Obama was in power, Congress managed to get their act together, and it was then Bush who made it happen in 2010 to remove the entry ban. Or Bush made it happen, and then came Obama. Yes, I think that was the case. Bush, we all know nobody liked Bush from our side. I can imagine, but he did something good. He brought medication to Africa under the PEPFAR program, and the removal of the US entry ban was bound into this PEPFAR program, and as this had agreement in Congress, the restrictions could be removed. That's a little bit the short thing what happened in the US, but it was a very complicated, complex undertaking to get these US entry ban off the table. The UNAIDS task team then had some impact. We had other countries lifting restrictions, South Korea, China, Bulgaria, Namibia, and Ukraine and India in 2010. Although China, I never trusted them. I realized later on that they said publicly that they had removed restrictions, but in reality, it didn't happen. So from 2010 to 24, the task team was no longer in operation. We had very minor changes in New Zealand, Canada, and Australia. New Zealand completely dropped any legislation. New Zealand is now free of restrictions, although it's still a bit complex, but basically there are no more restrictions. Nothing is left in the law. And Canada and Australia worked on their calculations, making the residence of somebody with HIV possible in theory, or I'm sorry, a little bit more likely, because they do a budget calculation. They cost what the person They calculate what a person would cost to the health system per year. And it was somewhere between $25,000 or $35,000 in their currency, and antiretroviral treatment alone was more expensive than their budget line. So it was impossible to be there. Now they increased their budget line, and it's now in theory possible that you can stay there. The situation in China continued to be very bumpy. China said they had no restrictions, but I had reports from people who were kicked out of the country. It's only 1.5 years ago that I got the final assurance that there are no longer any restrictions in China. And I had no longer reports coming from China about people being kicked out of the country. Now, let's look at the severe restrictions in where we have 17 countries affected. Among them, Bhutan, Brunei, Egypt, Iran, Kuwait, Malaysia, Russia, and the Emirates. Severe restrictions means there are entry bans. You are not allowed to enter the country if you live with HIV. There is compulsory testing, and there are deportations. Most affected are migrant workers in these countries, including second generation and students. I had cases of a Lebanese national whose parents had moved to the Emirates 40 years ago. He was born there. He was in his 20s, 25 to 30 years old, I don't remember. He was born in the Emirates. He has spent all his life in the Emirates. He couldn't become a national, and he was gay, and somehow he got HIV. And when his residence permit had to be renewed, he got into the trap. He ended up in prison, and he was kicked out of the country and sent to Lebanon. His family learned that he had HIV, and you can imagine the news, and that they could no longer see him. He had no family in Lebanon, nothing to do. So that's what happens in reality in the Middle East still today. It means loss of employment, separation from families, forced return to countries with poor healthcare or where you have nobody. And Kuwait deported 100 people last year. Dagestan, that's a Russian a province in Russia, deported 9 people. Libya too. I know there were more. I don't see Saudi figures. I often had cases from Saudi Arabia too. And I don't see Qatar, where I know it's also happening. And we don't have the figures from the Emirates, where I also know it happens. And we should also mention that Sweden has started deporting asylum seekers. Some of them live with HIV, and it's not always very clear if these people get treatment when they are sent back in their country. Then we have partial restrictions in about 33 countries, among them Australia, Canada. I won't go into detail anymore here. I have already explained that. Kazakhstan, Philippines, Slovakia, Singapore. In these countries, there are mandatory tests for long-term visa applicants, or residence permits are only given based on health cost. And there also might be barriers to access healthcare in these countries when you have a long-term residence permit. When we look at user issues, people had questions about restrictions, and I got an email from them and had to reply. What I observed in the past years until a year ago, the hot regions are the Middle East, Russia, and Singapore. One hot topic are these recruitment agencies I already mentioned. They just screen people without any point. Students are affected when they want to go to Canada, Australia, or Spain. The students in Spain, this affects mainly Latin American students. And they are allowed to come to Spain, they are allowed to study in Spain, but they have huge difficulties accessing the healthcare system because they live with HIV. Now, there is an HIV organization in Spain that is able to help them out, but it's a bureaucratic nightmare to get to treatment and healthcare access for such students in Spain. Then I got a lot of questions from transit passengers. People started flying through Doha and Dubai to the world, and usually a few days before the trip, they realize, heck, there is an issue. And then they sent me nervous messages. Transit passengers are generally not affected because you don't cross the border when you are in transit. But also airline and cruise ship crew contacted me quite often. A big issue is crossing borders with antiretroviral treatment and more recently also with PrEP medication. And the worst or the biggest concern I had was that there was a very weak global advocacy to remove these silly restrictions. This has now improved thanks to the HIV Justice Network taking over the website. What
You
can
will.
I do when I want to travel? In Europe, there is in principle no concern if you have an EU or Schengen passport. If you don't have an EU or Schengen passport, you have issues in Cyprus and Slovakia when you seek a long-term stay, you want to work or you want to study. Then that's not possible in both countries. In the Americas, Latin America, North America, in general, no concern. But in Canada, Cuba, Paraguay, you can run into troubles if you want to stay long term. But who wants to stay in Cuba long term? It's good for holidays, not for staying long term. Canada is a big issue. Lots of people want to study in Canada. Lots of people require legal assistance to do so. Africa, in general, no concern with the exception of Egypt. Tourism is possible in Egypt, but staying longer is not possible. Then there are issues with long-term stays in Angola, Liberia, and Sudan. When we go to the Middle East, it's a global hotspot for the most severe restrictions and deportations. Tourism is mostly possible, despite entry bans. So the entry ban doesn't mean you can't enter. The entry ban just means if they get you, they kick you out. But they can't really control tourists these days, and they don't have mandatory testing for tourist visits. As soon as a mandatory test is required, which is for long-term visa, you're in the trap and you can't go there. What we need to be aware about are very serious human rights violations and stigma in this area. So it's not a place to have a lot of fun and to hang around and seeking sexual adventures in the Middle East. I know Dubai is a hot spot and with a lot of action, but I would be very cautious. I would be very cautious in this area. In Asia, there is no concern for tourist destinations. It's a very mixed picture. Some countries have restrictions, so inform yourself before you travel. Tourism is usually not a problem. What is also huge in Asia are human rights violations and stigma. I realized this a couple of years ago. I was at an HIV conference in Amsterdam and I presented the database and I said that I was living with HIV since 1986. And then a journalist from Pakistan wanted to see me. He couldn't believe his eyes that somebody living with HIV looked as healthy as I did and living for so long with HIV. So the image of somebody having HIV is something very different from reality. And that's something you need to be aware of when you travel in general. People have stored images from the 1980s, and it's very difficult to overcome this. So I never talk about my HIV when I travel. And I would never disclose my status to authorities or to officials or to anybody if not absolutely required. So be very discreet when you travel. Um, Australia, Oceania is not a problem for tourism. Long-term stays are problematic in Australia and Papua New Guinea, as already mentioned. What can I do when traveling? Medication needs to be in your hand luggage. Why? Checked luggage can get lost. Who hasn't lost a piece of luggage? I often got people contacting me. I have all my medication in my luggage and it disappeared. What can I do now? Uh, so keep it in your hand luggage, even if that looks a little bit more risky. It's the safe place for any medication. And also travel with a reserve. You never know if a flight is cancelled or if you cannot travel for some other reason. Uh, Traveling with prescription medication always requires carrying a prescription with you. And that's a global rule. In no country you are in theory allowed to enter the country with prescription medication. Countries want to protect themselves from illicit drugs. This is why you need a prescription. I admit I never have a prescription on me. Never, never, never. But I knew how to speak myself out of the situation. If you want to be on the safe, in safe mode, you carry a prescription with you, and the prescription should not mention your condition, but the medication that you require for the treatment of a medical condition. Full stop. That's all what customs agents should know, that this is medication prescribed to you by a physician and you need this medication. If you travel frequently, my tip today would be switch to long-acting treatment, because then you have no prescription medication with you anymore. No. All you say is, I have a condition and I'm required to take this medication, and here's the prescription. Now the question might come up, they get curious and they ask you something. They want to know, what do you have? And then I always had something ready. I would say, oh, I had kidney replacement, a kidney transplant some weeks ago, and I need to take medication to control my immune system. I would say something very shocking to shut them up. So I don't want them to know I have HIV. Never at the border. And it's not their business. You could say it's not your business what I have. That's another option. What you also should check when you travel is your health insurance coverage. You might need a travel insurance. Some travel insurances exclude anything related to HIV if you're HIV positive. It depends a little bit on the country. There are travel insurances, sometimes with credit cards, sometimes with other insurances in a package where they don't check your HIV status and you get a good coverage. So that's something, if you travel often, something you should check if you're actually covered if something happens in the country where you go to. If you need to be very mindful if you travel to the US, because US health system costs are outrageous and you might need coverage there if something happens to you. Then something else I learned over time, your attire plays a role. I dress super, super good when I cross a border and when I deal with authorities, and I'm extra super friendly with them, because your image plays an important role. And also, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, be discreet. Being gay is not something accepted everywhere, and all you can do, I mean, it's silly wanting to educate other people in other countries on how they should look at gay people. Don't talk about it, be discreet. That's really my advice. It also has to do with being respectful with another country, with another culture that has different standards. These are really important things to consider when you are traveling. When you want to relocate for work or for retirement, and more I see people who want to retire to somewhere in Latin America, to somewhere in Europe, from other countries where the cost of living is higher. They want to go to a cheaper place. So inform yourself if there are restrictions, and inform yourself about your health insurance coverage. What is not a problem is when you are a diplomat and sent in a diplomatic mission to stay 2-3 years in a country. These people always had exceptions. Don't get caught by surprise and lose your job. I had so many stories of people getting caught by surprise, being disclosed to their employer with their HIV status, and losing their job. I also had people who bought a house without knowing that they can't live in the country. So it sounds funny, but if you want to relocate for work or retirement, especially retirement, check things out very carefully before you do that. Your insurance situation might be very different. I had a friend here a couple of days ago, actually 2 weeks ago. He went from Switzerland, he went to live in Africa, to Guinea. And he has a pleasant stay there, and cost of living is fantastic. And he is building a house, and everything is fine except his treatment. He has to travel to Bangkok twice a year, fill his pockets with generic medication from Bangkok, and then return to Africa because he has lost his health insurance in Switzerland. So that's not the situation you want to be in. And he even has to pay for his monitoring. So you can't just swallow medication when you live with HIV. Your treatment has to be monitored at least twice a year. And that's not a situation where I would put myself into. There are a number of resources out there that you can access, that you can check out. There are frequently asked questions on the Positive Destinations website. There is a resources page that you should look at, especially when you're relocating, and seek advice if you're not sure about something. I had 2-3 inquiries per day coming through the old site. I don't know how it is today because I'm no longer running the site, but quite often people still had questions or were not sure when they read the information on the site. And actually, this is the end of my presentation.